For thousands of years, the world believed one story about how humans reached the most remote islands on Earth. That story just broke apart in a lab. Before we go further, do one thing for me. If you have ever wondered where your own ancestors really came from, keep watching, because this story might make you question everything you were taught about human migration. Picture the widest ocean on the planet. Now, picture tiny dots of land scattered across it, thousands of miles apart from each other. Hawaii, Tahiti, Easter Island, New Zealand, Samoa. Some of these islands are separated by more open water than the entire distance across the United States. No radio, no compass, no metal tools. And yet, somehow, people found them. All of them. Every single speck of land in that endless blue. For centuries, explorers looked at this and felt something close to disbelief. How could ancient humans, using nothing but wooden canoes, cross oceans that modern sailors still fear today? It felt almost impossible, so people built a story to explain it. A comfortable story, a simple story. And for a long time, almost everyone accepted it without question. That story said the Polynesians drifted. It said they were accidental wanderers, pushed by storms, lost at sea, stumbling onto islands by pure luck. Some old theories even suggested they came from South America, floating westward on rafts, guided more by chance than by choice. This idea became famous. It shaped movies, books, and museum displays for generations. It painted the people of the Pacific as passengers of fate rather than masters of the ocean. But here is the uncomfortable question hiding underneath that story. If they were only drifting by accident, how did they reach so many islands, so far apart, with such incredible precision? How did they return home again and again? Luck does not explain a pattern that repeats across thousands of miles for thousands of years. That question sat quietly for a long time. Then science caught up to the mystery, and what it found did not just add a small detail. It rewrote the entire origin story of an entire ocean civilization. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how big this discovery really is, you need to understand what people used to believe with total confidence. For a long time, historians pictured Polynesian ancestors as simple castaways, people who left their homeland not out of purpose, but out of desperation, refugees of the sea blown off course, never truly choosing their destination. This idea felt tidy. It fit into an old, narrow way of viewing ancient people, as if only certain civilizations were capable of advanced navigation and everyone else was just along for the ride. This belief was strengthened by early European explorers who arrived in the Pacific centuries ago. When they saw islanders living without written language, without metal, without cities in the shape Europe recognized, they assumed a lack of sophistication. They could not imagine that these same people had already mastered something Europe hadn't: reading stars, reading ocean swells, reading the flight patterns of birds, reading the very shape of clouds to sense land beyond the horizon. So the myth of the accidental drifter stuck. It became textbook truth. It became the accepted version taught for generations. Nobody thought to question it deeply because it matched the assumptions people already carried. But assumptions are dangerous things. They feel like facts right up until new evidence forces them to crack. The first cracks came from something surprising: language. Researchers began noticing eerie similarities between languages, spoken thousands of miles apart across the Pacific. Words for canoe, words for family, words for the ocean itself. These words echoed each other from one island chain to another, even when the islands had no direct contact for centuries. That was strange. Drifting castaways, arriving by accident from many different unrelated places, should not leave behind a shared language pattern this clean, this consistent, this connected. If the old story was true, Polynesia should sound like a patchwork. Instead, it sounded like a family. This was the first curiosity loop, and it planted a question that would not go away. What if these people were not scattered drifters at all? What if they were something else entirely? Something history had underestimated? The language clue was powerful, but language alone could not settle the argument. People needed something deeper, something written not in old manuscripts, but inside the human body itself. That is where ancient DNA enters the story. In recent years, scientists have been able to do something that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago. They can extract fragments of DNA from ancient human remains, sometimes bones, that are hundreds or even thousands of years old, and read fragments of the story hidden inside them. This DNA acts almost like a diary written in a language of chemistry, quietly recording where people came from, who they were related to, and how populations moved and mixed across time. When researchers began applying this method to remains found across the Pacific Islands, something remarkable started to emerge. The genetic patterns did not support the picture of scattered, unconnected wanderers. They supported the opposite. They revealed a clear genetic trail, a traceable path of ancestry, moving steadily from island to island over a long stretch of time. This is where the story starts, breaking apart from what most people were taught. The ancient DNA evidence suggests that the ancestors of Polynesians did not begin their journey in Polynesia at all. Their roots trace back further west, toward regions near Taiwan and the islands of Southeast Asia. From there, over many generations, this population began a slow and deliberate expansion east and south across the Pacific, island by island, generation by generation. Notice that word, deliberate, not accidental, not random. The genetic footprints line up in a way that mirrors intentional, structured movement, not chaotic drifting. Let that sink in for a moment, because this is not a small correction. This is a complete shift in how we should picture these people. Instead of desperate castaways thrown by the wind, the DNA paints a picture of skilled seafaring communities who expanded across the largest ocean on Earth on purpose, carrying culture, language, and family lines with them as they went. But the story does not stop there, because the DNA revealed something even more surprising, something almost nobody expected. If you have heard the name Thor Heyerdahl before, you may already sense where this is going. Decades ago, this Norwegian explorer became famous for a wild theory. He believed Polynesians might have originally come from South America, not Asia. To prove it was possible, he built a simple wooden raft called the Kon-Tiki and sailed it across the Pacific from South America, successfully showing that such a journey could physically be done. For a long time, mainstream science pushed back against this idea. Most evidence pointed toward Asia as the origin point, not South America. Heyerdahl's theory was treated by many experts as an exciting adventure, but not an accurate history. Here's the twist that most people never saw coming. When scientists studied ancient and modern Polynesian DNA more closely, they found something unexpected woven into certain island populations, especially in the eastern Pacific, traces of ancestry connected to indigenous peoples of South America. This finding stunned many researchers. It meant that at some point in history, contact really did happen between Polynesian voyagers and people from the South American continent. Not through fantasy, not through a single dramatic movie-style event, but through real ancient human contact encoded permanently in DNA. This is the second curiosity loop of our story, and it forces us to ask something powerful. Were the Polynesians the ones who reached South America first, sailing incredible distances east before returning home? Or did South American voyagers make their own remarkable journey out into the Pacific, reaching Polynesian islands from the other direction? Some researchers believe the evidence leans toward Polynesians making contact with South America and then returning, carrying new ancestry back into their island communities. Others argue the reverse is still possible. The evidence suggests real contact happened, but historians still debate exactly how and exactly who reached whom first. Either way, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Two civilizations, separated by thousands of miles of open, dangerous ocean, somehow found each other long before Europeans ever crossed the Pacific. That is not an accident. That is one of the greatest feats of ancient human exploration in world history. And for a long time, almost nobody outside specialist circles even knew it happened. Take a moment and imagine what that voyage would have felt like. No engines, no satellite maps, no emergency signal to call for help. Just the stars above, the swells beneath the hull, and a deep trust passed down through generations of ancestors who had made journeys like this before. If you feel even a small chill imagining that kind of courage, type the word ocean in the comments, because that feeling is exactly what this story deserves. Now let's go even deeper, because DNA does more than trace where people came from. It can trace how people lived, how they connected, and sometimes how they suffered. As researchers expanded their studies across more islands, they began mapping out something incredible, a kind of family tree of the entire Pacific. Genetic connections showed clear links between islands, such as Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands, Tahiti, Hawaii, and Easter Island, sometimes called Rapanui by its own people. These links were not vague or distant. In many cases, they were tight, showing recent shared ancestry, meaning these expansions across the ocean happened relatively quickly in historical terms, not slowly drifting over tens of thousands of years, but spreading with impressive speed across many generations of skilled voyaging. This challenges another old assumption. Many people once imagined Pacific settlement as an extremely slow, almost accidental trickle over an enormous stretch of time. The genetic data tells a different story. It suggests organized waves of expansion, likely driven by choice, by exploration, by the same human hunger for new horizons that has pushed people to explore every corner of this planet throughout history. Here is where the emotional core of this discovery really begins to surface. These were not passive people carried by chance. These were explorers, navigators, engineers of the sea, who studied wave patterns the way modern scientists study data, who memorized star paths the way pilots memorize flight routes today. Traditional Polynesian navigation, still practiced and honored today by cultural knowledge keepers, involved reading subtle changes in ocean swells to sense land long before it became visible. It involved tracking star rises and star sets with extraordinary precision. It involved noticing the flight direction of certain birds that only nest on land, using that as a living compass. This was not guesswork. This was mastery, refined and passed down carefully across generations, likely for hundreds of years before written history in that region even began. And now think about what it means that modern DNA science is only now catching up to prove what oral traditions and cultural memory had been saying for a very long time. Many Pacific communities always held stories, chants, and genealogies describing long voyages, distant contact, and deep ancestral movement across the ocean. For a long time, some of these stories were dismissed by outside historians as legend rather than fact. Now, ancient DNA is quietly confirming pieces of what those oral traditions preserved all along. That raises an important and honest question worth sitting with. How much history gets erased or dismissed simply because it was not written down in the format outsiders expected? This is the third curiosity loop in our story, and it is one that goes far beyond just the Pacific Ocean. If oral history was right here, what other cultures around the world might hold truths that modern science is only beginning to verify? If this idea is landing with you, share this video with someone who has ever felt like their own family history was misunderstood or overlooked, because this story is really about more than islands. It is about whose history gets believed and whose gets doubted. Let's return to the DNA itself, because there is still more to uncover. As scientists compared genetic samples across different island populations, they also uncovered evidence of population bottlenecks, meaning moments in history where the number of people in a specific community became extremely small, possibly due to the challenges of long ocean voyages, limited resources on newly discovered islands, or the sheer difficulty of survival in isolated environments. Imagine arriving on an island so remote that no human being had ever set foot there before. No guarantee of fresh water, no guarantee of enough food, no way to call for rescue if something went wrong. Every single successful settlement represents an extraordinary act of human resilience. Some islands, like Rapanui, later known to the world as Easter Island, show particularly striking genetic patterns. This island became famous for its massive stone statues called moai, mysterious monuments that have fascinated people for centuries. For a long time, outside theories about Rapanui leaned toward dramatic collapse stories, framing its history around environmental destruction and internal conflict. But newer genetic research paints a more complex picture. Evidence suggests the population on Rapanui may not have collapsed in the way older theories claimed. Instead, some researchers believe the island's population remained more stable for a longer period, and any dramatic decline may be linked more directly to outside contact and disease introduced later by European arrival, rather than the island's own people destroying their environment through internal conflict alone. This matters deeply, because for a long time, the story of Rapanui was used almost like a warning tale about human self-destruction. If newer evidence shifts that narrative toward outside impact instead, it changes not just a historical detail, but the entire moral framing the world has placed on that island's people for decades. History is not just about facts. It is about which facts get chosen to tell a story and which explanation the world decides to believe. Let's widen the lens again, because this DNA revolution is not only rewriting Polynesian history, it is transforming how historians and scientists understand ancient human movement everywhere on Earth. For centuries, so much of world history was written primarily through the eyes of a few dominant cultures, often based on written records, physical artifacts, and outside observation. Cultures that relied more heavily on oral tradition, seafaring knowledge, or non-written forms of memory were frequently placed lower in assumed hierarchies of achievement. Ancient DNA research is quietly challenging that hierarchy across the globe, not just in the Pacific. It is revealing complex migration patterns in Africa that were previously oversimplified. It is uncovering surprising ancestral connections in the Americas. It is showing that human beings across every continent were far more mobile, far more connected, and far more advanced in navigation and exploration than previous generations gave them credit for. The story of the Polynesians becomes, in many ways, a symbol for something much bigger, a reminder that human history is still being rewritten, not through guesswork, but through evidence hidden quietly inside our own bones and our own blood. Think about that for a second. Every person alive today carries inside their body a kind of hidden map, silent evidence of every journey their ancestors ever made. Most of us will never fully know that map. But every so often, science manages to read a few more lines of it, and when it does, entire chapters of forgotten human courage suddenly come back into focus. If that gives you a strange sense of connection to people who lived long before you were born, sit with that feeling for a second, because that feeling is exactly why this kind of history matters. Now let's bring this back to the ocean itself, because that is where this story truly lives. Picture a double-hulled canoe, built by hand, using tools shaped from stone, bone, and shell. No metal nails, no modern rope. Just skill passed down through careful teaching, generation after generation. Picture a crew preparing to leave everything familiar behind, setting out into open water with no guarantee of finding land again. They would have watched the horizon for hours. They would have studied the color of the sky at sunset for clues about weather ahead. They would have noticed subtle shifts in wave direction that most modern people would never even detect. They would have trusted memory, trained observation, and generations of accumulated knowledge, not luck. When they finally spotted land, after days or even weeks at sea, imagine that moment. Land rising slowly out of the horizon, a place no human eye had ever seen before. That moment represents one of the purest expressions of human courage in history, and for a long time, the world barely acknowledged it as courage at all. It was framed instead as accident, as luck, as chance. Ancient DNA is helping correct that imbalance piece by piece, sample by sample, island by island. This does not mean every mystery about the Pacific is fully solved. Science rarely closes every door completely, and this story is no exception. There are still open questions. Researchers continue debating. Exactly how and when certain islands were first settled remains a topic of ongoing study. The full nature of contact with South America is still being explored, with some parts of the timeline still uncertain. Some genetic patterns raise questions that current evidence has not fully answered yet. But even with those open questions, one thing has become undeniable: the old simple story of accidental drifting. Castaways can no longer stand as the full truth. The evidence, both cultural and genetic, points towards something far more impressive: a story of intentional exploration, skilled navigation, deep oceanic knowledge, and human connection stretching across distances that still challenge our imagination today. Let's slow down here for a moment, because this is where the story becomes personal, not just historical. If you strip away dates, DNA charts, and scientific terms, what remains is something deeply human. A group of people looked out at an endless, dangerous ocean, and instead of fearing it into permanent silence, they learned to read it. They turned uncertainty into knowledge. They turned survival into mastery. And over many generations, they built one of the most impressive networks of human connection the ancient world ever produced, linking islands separated by thousands of miles into a shared cultural and ancestral family. That achievement deserves to be remembered accurately, not simplified, into a story about lucky accidents. And this brings us to the deeper meaning hiding underneath this entire discovery. History is not fixed. It is not something locked away forever in old books, untouchable and unchangeable. History is something we are still uncovering, still correcting, still learning to see more clearly, sometimes with the help of science we did not even have available just a few decades ago. The story of the Polynesians was misunderstood for a long time, not because evidence did not exist, but because the right tools to read that evidence had not been developed yet. That raises a quiet but powerful question worth carrying with you after this video ends. How many other stories, other cultures, other ancestors are still waiting to be properly understood, simply because science has not yet caught up to what oral memory and lived experience already knew? Before we close the story, I want you to imagine one final image. Somewhere, centuries ago, a young navigator stands at the edge of a canoe, staring out at open water that stretches farther than the eye can see. No modern technology exists to guide them. Only knowledge, courage, and trust in everything they were taught. They do not know exactly what lies ahead. They only know they were built for this journey, trained for it, prepared for it by every generation that came before them. That same spirit of exploration is written quietly into the DNA of millions of people alive today, connecting modern Pacific communities directly to those ancient voyagers who dared to cross an ocean many believed was uncrossable. The Polynesians were never simply drifters carried by chance. They were pioneers of the sea, explorers whose courage helped connect one of the largest regions of our planet. Long before modern maps, modern ships, or modern science existed to prove what they had already accomplished. And now, because of ancient DNA, the world is finally beginning to tell their story the way it always deserved to be told. If this story changed the way you see human history, even just a little, that is exactly the kind of quiet shift worth holding on to. Because the next time someone tells you a piece of history is fully settled, remember this ocean, remember these voyagers, and remember that the truth is sometimes still waiting quietly to be uncovered.